Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum, namaste, sat sri akal. My name is Farheen Khan and you're watching the Azeeza show. This week I am saddened to say that we have to talk about this topic, but it's one that is absolutely necessary. We all heard about the attacks in New Zealand on the mosques, and I think there's something to be said about talking about mosque attacks and terrorism and the rise of right-wing extremism around the world. And so with me in studio is Fatima Sajan from the NCCM. Welcome, Fatima.
Thank you, Farheen.
Thank you. And there's also Mariam, who's actually joining us remotely. So I want to also take a moment to welcome Mariam.
Thanks so much for having me on the program today, Farheen.
So Fatima, let's talk about, how do you define terrorism? And do you feel like the term has sort of evolved over time?
Well, Farheen, that's a loaded question. I mean, there's a lot of definitions of terrorism, and in Canada, I think it's under Criminal Code Section 83, terrorism is defined as an act in part or in whole based on religious, political, or ideological motive that is meant to intimidate the public. At the NCCM, we've noticed that there's a perception among many Muslims that feel that terrorism label is only applied when a perpetrator of a violent act is identified as Muslim. And what that does to the community is really sheds a negative light on us and puts us in deep concern about how we're being vilified. And what this does to people who promote the far right ideology is that it gives them more strength to their argument that Muslim communities don't have the same, don't share the same values, and as a result don't deserve the same rights. So it's a really big problem.
Thank you. And Mariam, how do you feel? What's your definition of terrorism, and how has that evolved over time?
That's a really good question. I think the word terrorism is evolving. In the 70s, it meant somebody who created terror. Didn't mean it didn't have anything to do with identity, whereas in the 80s and 90s, it really took on an identity of somebody who was Muslim. And now we see that the term is changing once again, that it doesn't just mean Muslims, it's encompassing everybody that is part of some type of a dangerous ideology that spreads hate, whether that means you're ISIS or whether that means that you're part of any type of radicalization, white nationalist group. And really, the IRA is also back in business again as of, the whole Brexit stuff. So they're definitely targeted and labeled as a terrorist organization as well.
So let's go into this deeper, Fatima. So in terms of I guess one of the things that I wanted to talk about was, and Mariam as well, I know that, even up until like a couple of years ago, before the Quebec City mosque massacre right here in Canada, that, the definition even, to at our highest level of enforcement, let's say the RCMP, for example, they weren't really looking at right-wing extremism, right? They weren't really thinking about that. That wasn't on their radar. And the reason why I was told was that, was basically that because the Muslim community is being targeted so much, that there's a higher likelihood that we would essentially retaliate or try to become radicalized, and therefore it made sense to focus on our community as opposed to sort of this this sort of emergence of right-wing extremism. And then sure enough, a few weeks later, after going to the session for Muslims, we see this mosque massacre. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, so it's a really good point. I mean, we've felt really frustrated by this as well. What's really sad and frustrating is in the lead up to the Quebec City mosque massacre, actually 6 weeks prior, public safety cut funding to do research on research and funding to look at far-right extremism 6 weeks before the attack happened. And to learn that after 6 people died in a mosque in Canada was gut-wrenching. to know that it could have been stopped.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there was also a public safety report that came out last year where there was very, very little emphasis on the concern around far-right extremism, and so much emphasis placed on Muslim communities. And that, again, was so problematic that, it's not considered a priority. And when we look at Islamic extremism and far-right extremism, it's so deadly, it's so dangerous.
Absolutely.
And as a community, I think, now, if not now, then when?
Yes.
When are we going to call it out and
Absolutely.
put pressure on our elected officials that, this needs to be a priority? For
sure. No, I actually want to take a moment to ask Mariam as well. So, one of the things that's come up that I think is really important here is also to talk about, let's shift the conversation a little bit and let's talk about New Zealand, right? 49 people were killed in 2 mosques on Friday, at Friday prayers, when we know is meant to be, the time where the most Muslims would be in the mosque, right? Like, what was the motivation for this attacker to do what he did?
Well, I mean, it's kind of like the $25,000 question at this point. What is it that radicalized this young man to do the worst thing that anyone could possibly do, going into a house of worship while people are praying and worshiping, and just taking out all of their aggression and hatred on them by killing them. Really, the things that lead to this is again, I'm not a psychologist and I haven't gone through any mental health training, but there's certainly a mental health component to it, and something definitely went wrong, maybe in the upbringing of the child, or they weren't paid attention to enough. So I really think that in order for us to mitigate these things is to just pay attention to what your kids are listening to, hearing, doing. And, this person was a young man. Obviously, he's older than and can do whatever his parents don't want him to do. But, when did it start? Where did it start? And we also know that a lot of the blame can go on to all of the messaging that's coming out of the White House at this time. There have been I think over 80 situations in which Trump has made Islamophobic remarks in his speeches publicly, Twitter, what have you. And, we see that there's a huge rise in hate crimes, not just to Muslims, but to Jewish people and to Black people. And, it's not just that they're targeting Muslims, but they're targeting anyone who isn't white. And it's white nationalism that is to blame for this particular shooting. And it's devastating, really, that these things haven't been really taken seriously. Ever since the Quebec shooting, the shooting that happened in Sweden a couple of years ago, and some of the other white nationalists in Charlottesville, how people went into a church, they really have to zero in and figure out what's radicalizing these youths, and why is it that they're acting this way? Not just the what, but the how and the why. I think they really need to get to that and really start surgical, targeted campaigns into either re-educating these people or figuring out how they can remove these materials away from these young men.
What do you think, Fatima?
Well, according to the reports, he seemed to be motivated by white nationalist, anti-immigrant, and far-right extremist ideology. And it's very scary. Like, the risks of unchallenging far-right extremism are so scary. I mean, we saw in Quebec with the attacker that he was also a far-right extremist. And the scary thing was that hate sort of emboldens hate.
Yes.
That what happened in one corner of the world emboldened another person to carry out a similar attack in another corner of the world,
yes.
which is so scary. And then
yes.
just days after the attack in New Zealand, you see an attack in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
And what we noticed, a very clear example is after the Quebec City mosque attack, 1 month after the attack happened, that entire month we saw the highest increase in hate incidences that we've seen in the entire year.
Right.
So in 2017, it really peaked.
Yeah.
So there's just something about, one thing leading to another, hate emboldening hate, and it's very scary.
Absolutely. And I think, having gone to Quebec City and actually having met the families of the victims there, like, it's just, I know how difficult that experience has been for those families. I mean, just in speaking to them very briefly, to think that their little kids are, running to the door and calling for their fathers, thinking they're going to walk through the door when we knocked, right? Or to know that, the women are just saying, like, when we ask, how can we help you? They're just like, I just want them to come back, right? Like, bring them back. Like, how do you answer those questions? It's so difficult to hear that and to see that and to know the stories of all the people who are now interconnected in that community in Quebec. So I want to, so I guess the big question for me is that, and Mariam, I'll ask you the same thing. Have we made progress since Quebec City? Has anything really changed? I mean, I feel like that's the big question in my mind right now. It's like we've done so much advocacy. We're trying to raise awareness. We're constantly trying to be out there in the community, and we're encouraging our own communities, to try and be more, quote, integrated and to engage more and to, build bridges. And we're always doing this type of work, right? But it feels like it's just not happening. What do you think?
You know what, it's funny, I was thinking about the same things, and I feel like, you think about 2 years ago, we lost 6 people.
Yeah.
You fast forward 2 years later, and we've lost 51 people.
Yeah.
And it's, I was thinking, what more could we do? And we do have lessons that we've learned, but have we implemented those lessons?
This is it.
In interfaith dialogue, I mean, for years people have been promoting dialogue, and it's very important, but it seems now more than ever, it's so important because it fundamentally changes the way people think about us and interact with us. And education number one. Right now at NCCM, we're going into schools, we're doing work on Islamophobia. So at the very beginning, we're able to change the way people think about Muslims and Islam.
Great.
That's first and foremost. And then politics, like you said yourself.
Yes.
It's so important, especially now with an election year. Putting pressure on our elected officials, holding them accountable.
For sure.
What are they going to change now?
Yeah.
Right? There's just so much there. And as a community, like we've tried, but it's not enough. There's so much.
Sure.
And there's this in the ayah in the Quran that says, with every difficulty comes ease. So I'm very hopeful that this tragedy will bring us closer together, and we will work as hard as we have to. We owe it to the people who lost their lives.
Absolutely.
And we owe it to our future generation. There's just a lot to do.
We're just going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back. Okay, we'll be back right after this. Hi everyone, welcome back. So just before the break, I was talking about the Quebec attack and the mosque massacre there 2 years ago, and whether we've made progress. So Mariam, how do you feel about about that? Have we made progress?
I actually think we learned a lot. A lot of us, I was born in Canada, and I actually, what did we learn? We learned that everyone's with us. We learned that we have friends. We learned that people will protect us. And it was a really nice thing to learn. When you are singled out and, targeted and people are out there hating on you and, wanting to kill you for whatever ideology they follow. To learn that people on the ground really don't see any difference between us and them, that is a really humbling thing. And I think that that's where I go to for my inspiration, for my personal inspiration, is I never look at leaders because we've been sadly disappointed with a lot of leadership. But when you talk to your neighbor, or you go outside and someone smiles at you or asks you, or says to you, "Oh, I really like your hijab today." Like that's a really nice thing to do, and that's a really nice thing to learn. Is that we're all in this together, and Canadians feel like that was their mosque that got shot. It wasn't just a Muslim mosque; it was a Canadian mosque. So that was a really humbling thing. I think we learned. We also learned that we have to be vigilant. There are evil actors, and we have to we have to be aware of what's happening around us. We have to listen to the rhetoric, and we have to kind of prepare ourselves for things that could be down the pipeline. There are people that do the copycat crimes, and that's worrisome right now.
Okay, so Fatima, you were talking before the break about interfaith dialogue. I actually want to talk about solutions and kind of like how can we avoid these types of attacks in the future?
Right, Farright, it's such an important question. I mean, one of the things I think that's really important is challenging Islamophobia and racism when we see it, like calling it out. Not just being a bystander, but an upstander and helping to change the narrative. I mean, if you look at the Prime Minister of New Zealand, she's been really promoting the message of going beyond just doing what's necessary in the aftermath of the attack and being really compassionate and reaching out to their Muslim neighbors. And I think that's really a strong message and really helps to change the narrative. So I think that's as a starting point, that would really help.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and the reason I brought back the interfaith dialogue pieces is that I feel like we've had too much dialogue. To be perfectly honest with you, I feel like we need to take action, right? And having dialogue is good, but I feel like the people who engage in that, they're a limited number, right? The general public is not going to interfaith dialogue meetings, right? Let's be clear on that. How do we engage the general public? And I think one of the things that I've appreciated just even listening today on the radio was this, this idea that people are actually, even the radio stations are talking about, go find a mosque in your community, right? Go have a look and talk to somebody. Like, really making it something that's become suddenly a mainstream issue. People are, I mean, I've seen, reactions both in the shops just recently, right? Some people are looking at me very, terribly, and other people are smiling and kind of almost feel like, hey, I'm here, like, don't be afraid type of thing, right? So I mean, I think that's the question is like, how do you really bring those people, do we have town halls? Do we start to, really do something that really starts to speak to not just what is Islamophobia, but how are we as, people more than just what you see on our TV screens, right?
Right. No, you're absolutely right. We have had a lot of dialogue, and often it's preaching to the converted, right?
Exactly.
So it's the limited group of people who already value dialogue.
Yes.
So I think one of the ways, because I'm also part of an interfaith group in the area where I live, and one of the things that we do is do activities together, whether it's helping the homeless or helping at a food bank. That helps. So interacting.
For sure.
And my local, there's a church in my neighborhood. I always say it's my church. Like, I'm going to church. I think that's kind of sharing those experiences are really important.
For sure.
So we need to do more of that. Visit, not just wait for people to come visit our mosque, but invite them and do more work together. Because at the end of the day, we're Canadian citizens, so we are affected by a lot of the same issues, whether it's healthcare, environment, climate change. It's the same issues, education, seniors' pension. So there's so many issues that can bring us together and helps to humanize us. So I think that's
part of the problem.
That's part of the problem.
We've become so dehumanized, right, in the media and other places that it just becomes so much easier. And I think that I want to just take it back to Mariam as well. Mariam, how do you feel about this? What can be done, to avoid such attacks in the future?
So I went through some of the things that I would do, logistically with the mosques and with our community. But I think there's a big outreach component to this. I think we need to help and be part of the decision-making process in terms of how we protect our mosques. So go out there, speak to your mayor's office, make a request to bring the mayor over to view the mosques, view your places of worship, other organizations that are within your Muslim community. Have a dialogue with your city, with the police, with the RCMP, with CSIS, with OPP, with your MPs, with your MPPs. Go out there, meet these people, make sure they know you're there, and help them make the decision on how to protect your places of worship. I also think that outreach is a really good thing. Go out there, sit on boards and commissions, and be present within the Canadian family, the full Canadian family, not just to sit on Muslim boards, but go out there, sit on different boards. I mean, I sit on the library board. It's an interest of mine. Go out there, apply for commissions, apply for these things, and be present, and always try to, like, you're part of this community, act as such and be as such, and you'll see that will be reciprocated. The federal government also has grants at this point in time where that they provide security for communities at risk, and ours at this point, I would say, is a community at risk, and I would contact the NCCM. They have someone that works on this stuff directly, and I think it's important that they do this sort of thing, just so that there is funding out there, and that they get the well-needed funding for their institutions.
I mean, it's such a hard thing, right, Fatima? Because it's just like, you also want to, at the same time, dialogue is important, engagement is important, but also safety and security, right? So it's like suddenly starting to think about, like, how do you make sure our mosques are secure? How do we make sure that, are we doing safety audits then of the mosque to make sure that, people are able to leave a mosque in the event of an emergency? Or we're making sure that doors are being checked and that, we've got security and police standing outside? Like, what are the things that we do? Because I think there's always this sense of, like, there's two types of individuals we're working with here, right? There's those that are, quote, ignorant, who don't know any better, who just want to learn, or who need to learn to be able to make a better judgment of who we are. But then there's also, quite literally the right-wing extremists who, really don't care to know where to learn, right? So how do you protect yourselves from that?
Right.
So is right-wing extremism, in your opinion, are we doing enough to challenge that?
It's a major issue. I think the first thing we need to do is bring more attention to right-wing extremism, make our communities understand why it's such a priority. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to public safety, finding out, like, are they making this a priority? Mm-hmm. Is there more research behind it, more funding behind it?
Right.
And one of the things that we're hopeful for is the recent the anti-racism budget that was announced.
Right.
So we're hopeful that there's an opportunity there for our elected officials to do some work around this. Mm-hmm. It's much needed, and if not now, when?
Absolutely. Right. If not now, when? So, Mariam, how do you feel? Are we doing enough to deal with right-wing extremism?
That's a really hard question to answer, Farheen. I really think that we don't know what's happening at a CSIS level. I mean, it's all clandestine investigations, and unless somebody's willing to say something, it's really hard to kind of tap into those networks. I mean, obviously the RCMP knows of the white, those white supremacy groups that are around. And fine, as much as we don't like them being around, and we fear, and they create fear for us, if they're not going to act in a violent manner, then as much as I hate to say this, there is still space in the community for them, as long as they don't commit hate crimes. So again, I don't know what's happening on that level. I think that in light of what's going on in the world, the shift in how we perceive terrorism, I think that money will probably be going towards funding and investigating racial incidences created by white nationalist groups. I can't say for sure, but I think that's probably the way things have to go.
Okay, so one of the last questions I wanted to touch on was, and you've talked about it a little bit as well, is just this idea of, like, what can politicians do, right? I know that one of the things that's come up in the community lately is the comments that were made by Andrew Scheer, right, recently when New Zealand happened, and his I would say intentionality, if that's a word, to say that he purposefully didn't mention the word Muslims, right? Like, if for me, because I ran in 2015 and I, ran, because Mr. Stephen Harper was being very anti-Muslim, I think that that's just, again, trying to continue on this path of divisive politics, right? Which is what, in my opinion, started Quebec City in the first place. So, what can politicians do?
The words of our elected officials matter. We saw in 2015 with Prime Minister Harper that it was a niqab issue, and Muslims were the center point of fear.
That's right.
So politics was like politicians scored points on our backs. Really.
Yeah, but I mean, look at also what he said, right? And this is partly why I think I decided to really take action on that for myself, was when he said, specifically, like, we'll find those jihadists whether they're in the mosques or in the homes, right? How can you paint the entire community with that brush, right? Those extremists that quote represent Islam are not representatives of my community or myself or my faith, right? So you can't just go around doing that. And then 2 years later, or a few years later, now we see the seeds that were planted then, coming to fruition, right, with Quebec City. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think politicians don't always remember or realize, or maybe they do realize, but ultimately the impact of those irresponsible, words and their actions are impacting us on the ground day to day, right? Mm-hmm. We're the ones who are having our hijabs pulled off, or being attacked in the streets, or being called names, or not getting jobs because supposedly we don't belong, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, if you look right now, like, there's so many microaggressions, not just the big tragedies that we're seeing, but every day, like you said, Muslim sisters being harassed on the streets.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of things happening right now. And Quebec is a really pivotal, is at a very pivotal point right now. Mm-hmm. Because if we don't address the far-right extremism in Quebec now, with the CAQ government, then it could trickle into other provinces. So that's why it's so important in this election year that we fight the fight. We have to win, because we need to send a strong message. All eyes are on Quebec. What happened in New Zealand, right? All eyes are on Quebec. If we don't address it now, it could happen not just in other places in Canada, but in the world.
For sure.
So we definitely need to hold our politicians accountable, tell them not to use wedge politics or identity politics, and definitely don't do it on our backs.
For sure. For sure. Well, thank you so much for being in studio with us today. And thank you, Mariam, for being on the show as well.
Thanks so much for having me today.
We appreciate you both, and thank you for all the work that you're doing in the community to try and, address this challenge and this ongoing struggle that we have. And to the viewers, thank you for watching. If you're dealing with this issue of Islamophobia, or you're concerned in any way for your safety, please be careful, make sure you reach out, make sure that those incidents are being documented, and feel free to reach out to us directly. Until next week, take care.